I made a project last year. Hang on. Made a project last year with a group of former child combatants from Cauca in Hambalo, 25 of them. We spent 3 months making an animation of their experiences. So I want to show you that film, that short film, because it basically explores the issues that I'm going to introduce you to today. So first of all, we're going to talk about forced recruitment in numbers, how it kind of occurred throughout the Colombian conflict. But forced recruitment as a concept is actually a contested theory. It's quite complex. So we're going to unpick some of those issues. And I want to talk specifically about the armed forces and the state, because often when we talk about forced recruitment of minors, we ignore the fact that military service and conscription happens in Colombia. So the question is conscription, is military service also forced recruitment? We'll take a look at it from the legal perspective, which, as you might imagine, is quite rigid. And then we'll talk about the 3 C's, which is a way, I think it's a great way to analyze the theory and the causes and underlying problems of forced recruitment and what makes children and young people join armed groups and join organized crime. Then we'll look at how forced recruitment is still happening today, post the peace agreement with FARC. Forced recruitment, as I'm sure you know, is unfortunately another big issue in so-called post-conflict Colombia. But then we're going to look at something that I've come up with in my research, which I've called a spectrum of determinant factors, which is an attempt to kind of blend theory and practice, if you like, what happens really on the ground in terms of why children, why young people join armed groups. And then at the end, we'll look at what children actually do within armed groups and the criminal trajectory that they have once they're in that space. So the most reliable numbers that exist come from the Centro de Memoria Histórica, which is an institution I'm sure you're familiar with. These numbers come from the time when the Centro de Memoria was perhaps a more reliable and more impartial institution than it is today. That's a complicated thing that we won't get into. But in terms of the recruitment that happened in Colombia, they do have the most reliable figures, because those figures are based on a collation of data from other sources, from the Defensoría del Pueblo, from ICBF, and other government agencies, which all have different data. So they estimate that there were almost 17,000 cases of forced recruitment in the Colombian conflict between 1958 and 2016, when the FARC signed the peace accords. And you can see by these figures that FARC were responsible for more than half of that recruitment. I'm going to whiz through these numbers pretty quickly because I'd like to have more time to have a discussion at the end. They say 40% of children and young people that they interviewed, or most were adults that they interviewed, talking about how they entered the groups as children. 40% of them said they were persuaded, which is an interesting term, which we'll come back to. But there was no information on the majority of cases. And 11% of them were coacted, which is a term that the researcher that wrote this report has decided to use. I think it's an important term. Coaction is an important concept. It's one of the 3 C's, and we'll come back to that. But I use coaction in a slightly different sense to, I think, how it's been used in this report. Those 11% there, if you read the report in detail, are basically children or teenagers that were coerced, that were forced, that were kidnapped, that were forced to take part against their will. And that's the big gap, really, in the theory and in practice. To what extent is this forced recruitment? Can children, join voluntarily? So that's one of the big issues that we will come back to. 71% of those that were recruited were male. So you can see that there was a big gender gap in terms of recruitment. The vast majority were male. And also, I haven't put the figure on here, but the Afro-Caribbean community and indigenous communities were also disproportionately affected in terms of recruitment. You can see here how recruitment expanded throughout the conflict. Again, all of these statistics are from the Centro de Memoria. So in 1964, there were only 2 recorded cases. And in 2003, there were 1,400. Yeah, so you can see how it grew. I think we need to treat the numbers with caution, because obviously these are only the numbers that they were able to verify and confirm. I would suspect in reality that the numbers, just as today post peace agreement, are much higher than the actual figures that we have here represented. So these are the ages of men, of boys that were recruited. And you can see that the vast majority are recruited between the ages of 12 and 16, 76% of them, which is, I suppose, not surprising. There were cases of younger children, 0.5%, but the majority are teenagers. And that's the same for females. I don't know why, but they've changed the category. Again, this comes from the Centro de Memoria. They changed the age gaps with the girls. But again, you can see that the vast majority are between the ages of 12 and 15. But it is a complex issue, as I've said already. So 3 questions that we need to be thinking about this morning as we go through the presentation is forced recruitment really forced? The majority of children that join, and I've interviewed quite a few of them, don't say that they were forced. They say that they chose to, that they were encouraged to. Some because joining the FARC meant that they got a hot meal every day. Others joined the FARC because their parents had been killed. And so joining the FARC was basically a way of them ensuring their kind of economic survival, if you like. So, is forced recruitment really forced is one of the big questions. And can the recruitment of minors be voluntary? And really this relates to that question, because children say they join because they want to, but at what age can children decide, or children and teenagers decide they know what they want? And this is really complex, because in terms of the law, all recruitment of children is illegal. And so whether it's voluntarily or not. So from a legal perspective, the answer is all recruitment of children is forced. But I think as a society, and as academics especially, I think sometimes we tend to depoliticize children. So we paint children as innocent victims that aren't really sure of the circumstances that they live in. And I don't think that's always true. From the children that I've spoken to, or the adults who were children when they were recruited, many of them say they knew what they were doing. And they joined because they wanted a hot meal. They joined because they wanted a family. And they say that was their free will to do so. And that may be. But then we have to think beyond that and think, well, if we live in a society, if we live in a state where children do not have hot meals and they're having to join an armed group to get a hot meal, well, then is that their fault, or is it the state's fault? And so if they're forced, to what extent is their input in this concept of being forced? And so there are many academics that say, actually, we shouldn't really think about it as forced or voluntary, because that's a binary that really doesn't help and is extreme. But in between, there's this gray area. And we'll come back to that, because that's what I call the 3 C's. The 3 C's help us to understand this gray area between being forced and voluntarily deciding to join an armed group. which is really the key concept in this whole idea. And then, as I've said, what about the state? And hopefully we'll get time to discuss this, because I'd like to know what you think. If we were in a room where this was easier to do face to face, we could probably have a discussion about this now. But I think we'll save it until the end because of the complications of working virtually. So is military service, conscription as it's called, is that forced recruitment? It's a complex issue because in some ways it is, because it's illegal not to do forced recruitment unless you have a reason within the law to deny it. But then, is the state recruiting minors? Is it recruiting children and teenagers under 18? Does that matter? Well, the army will say that they don't recruit children under 18, but they definitely did, and it did happen in the past. I returned from a trip to Valpes just before Christmas. I did a case study in Valpes of this idea of recruitment, because Valpes is one of the hot spots currently in Colombia in terms of dissident FARC recruiting children and teenagers. But actually, so are the army. I met a lot of young indigenous men in Mitu, in the city, the capital city of Valpes, who said that basically it's dangerous for them to go out at night. Yeah, they go out on a Friday night, they drink a lot, they get drunk, and often there are soldiers preying on these vulnerable teenagers. They, in their words, kidnap them drunk, take them to the barracks and enlist them. And I spoke to at least 6 18-year-olds to whom this had happened. And that's complicated on many reasons. Okay, they're 18, so they're not minors, but actually indigenous communities do not have to do military service, but they don't know that, and the army doesn't tell them that. So this is an issue that is complex, and it's an issue that continues today in Colombia, in Colombia's marginalized communities. So if you look at the theory, there's kind of a dichotomy or another binary, let's say, between 2 extremes, which we might call supply and demand. So the supply end focuses more on social issues and argues that children and teenagers join armed groups because of poverty, because of poor employment opportunities, limited educational opportunities. And then on the other side of the spectrum, the argument is that basically the demand side is more of a theoretical attraction, because basically child soldiers are more cost effective, i.e. they're cheaper. Armed groups don't have to pay children as much as they have to pay adults. In many cases, children aren't paid at all. Children become more loyal to the armed group because they become more dependent on the armed group. There's a lot of literature about how children enhance the military capacity of an armed group, especially in Africa, because a lot of the weapons became lighter and children are more agile. So all of those issues. But I would caution against saying that one issue is the only reason for child recruitment or forced recruitment, because at the end of the day, it's a mixture of all of these. It's wrong to say there is only one issue. If you look at the reality of the situation, if you talk to children, teenagers, and adults that were recruited as children and teenagers, you'll find a whole mix of this theory. I've put the names on there, and I've given this presentation to Sylvia, so I'm sure she'll share it with you at some point. But if you want to read any of the literature or have any other questions that we don't discuss today, then feel free to email me. So what's the actual definition of a child soldier? This is the definition from UNICEF in 1997. It says anyone under the age of 18 who is part of any kind of regular or irregular force or armed group in any capacity, including but not limited to cooks, porters, messengers, and anyone accompanying such groups other than family members. The definition includes girls recruited for sexual purposes and forced marriage. so it's quite a wide definition. I think there are several issues with this definition, and actually it was redefined slightly in 2007 to include boys that were recruited for sexual purposes, because I think that's one of the problems with this definition, is that it doesn't necessarily recognize that boys and teenage boys were recruited for sexual purposes, or are recruited for sexual purposes. So again, and this idea of family members, I think that's quite problematic. We all know that there were many children born into families within the FARC, and those children had no choice but to become guerrilleros. So for me, that's another concept of forced recruitment. But here in this definition from UNICEF, it's excluded, which I think is really interesting, because I think it's wrong. So we can come back to that. If you have any questions about this definition or comments, we'll come back to it. But there's also literature that says we need to expand the definition of child soldier, not just in terms of within the armed group, like we just discussed, so in terms of including sexual victims as both boys and girls, but actually including all child victims, all children that have lived with conflict. And in Colombia, these figures are from the Truth Commission, there were 2.3 million child victims. So they're not just children that were forcibly recruited, but they're children that lost parents, children that were displaced, children that were kidnapped. And there are still 41,000 missing children as a result of the conflict in Colombia, which are astonishing figures. But so as I say, there's literature that argues that actually, well, we should be thinking about child soldiers and child soldiering, not just as children that pick up arms and joined an armed group, but also informants, and I'm reading from this definition here, reporting, resource acquisition, forced migration, displacement, voluntary conscription, and a myriad of other occupations. So that's taking in children that don't necessarily join the armed group, pick up a weapon, but children that are used by the armed group to spy on their communities and give information on enemies, which was really common. And there's a big difference, which is really important to note, I think, between forced recruitment, which is the employment of children in armed groups, and the utilization of children. This is a divide that exists within the literature. Children that are utilized are basically children that don't go off and live with the armed group in the jungle or in the mountains, excuse me, but they are children that still live at home, live in their communities, but in one way or another work for the armed group. Perhaps they're spying on their neighbors, they're giving information, or they move things around, they move guns around, they move drugs around. Children are used by armed groups because children are very rarely stopped or searched by the military. So children can be a good asset for groups that need to move stuff around. So again, there is academic theory and research that basically says it doesn't matter whether we're talking about recruitment or utilization, they're all children, they're all being used, and so we need to expand our definition of child soldiers and child soldiering. Whoops. So, where do we stand on the law? Well, human rights law says that basically anyone under 18 that is recruited into an armed group, it's illegal. And then there is a treaty. So human rights law says anyone under 18 being recruited is illegal. Then there's a treaty to which Colombia is a signatory that says any child under the age of 15 being signed up to a criminal group, armed group, is a war crime. So although in law it's 18, signatories to the treaty, a UN treaty that I'm not trying to remember what year that UN treaty was signed, 2000 and something, that says anyone under the age of 15. So basically in Colombia, anyone being recruited under the age of 15 is a war crime, and that's because Colombia signed up to this treaty. So how do we deal with then this complex situation of, is it forced or is it not forced? And move away from the legal definition. Legal definitions are obviously very helpful in terms of holding people to account. And we know now with the HEP that there's a special case, 007, a bit like James Bond, dealing with the forced recruitment of children into the Colombian conflict. But as we've already discussed, it's really much more complex than that. So I suggest this model of the 3 C's, 3 concepts: co-option, coaction, and coercion. Now, this can get quite complicated because all of these 3 words are very similar, but actually they're also very, very different. So co-option, if we look at kind of dictionary definitions, is to appropriate, to assimilate, or to win over. Now, this model of co-opting children into joining armed groups is quite common in communities that lived with the armed group. Because basically, as you know, in marginalized communities in Colombia, the armed group becomes the state. And for many kids, the armed group becomes really the only career option. And these kids are living in the presence of the armed group. They're living by the laws of the armed group. And so as they grow up over time, it's actually probably a reasonably normal process for them to join the armed group. So it's kind of a process that just happens naturally, if you like, although we shouldn't use that word because there's nothing natural about children joining armed groups. And then we move to coaction. We all know this feeling of really having to do something, feeling forced to do something even though we don't really want to. Well, that's this concept of being coacted into do something. Yeah, we feel a compulsion. We don't want to, but we feel compelled, we feel impelled to do something, which may be against our will, but there is something that forces us to do it, and so we do it. And that's something that we find a lot with children and teenagers that have joined armed groups, especially in situations where children may be orphans because their parents have been killed by other armed groups. It may be that children have been abandoned by their parents, which sadly happens a lot in marginalized communities, and so they feel this compulsion. It's a survival instinct almost. They have to join because if they don't, they will probably die, and it is as basic as that. And then coercion, which is this model that we're much more used to: people being forced, pulled, kidnapped into joining the armed group. And within that model then of the 3 C's, there's a whole bunch of what I call determinant factors along structural, emotional, environmental, and criminal lines. In terms of economic necessity, educational opportunities, gun culture. A lot of kids that just join because they're obsessed with guns. Instability at home. The emotional angle covers friendship. A lot of people join because their friends did. Love and seduction. Seduction is a technique that is really underestimated and is quite common when you speak to ex-combatants. They will tell you that, and this is happening a lot recently in Chocó. There are indigenous communities reporting how young men arrive in the reservation and basically seduce the young women into going off with them to join the armed group. And it happens a lot with women as well. Women will assent to seduce teenage boys. So that's a technique that's really underestimated, but happens probably a lot more than what we think it does. Revenge is a big factor. A lot of children join to seek revenge on the other armed group that killed their parents. And family ties. Family, if your parents are in the guerrilla, it's very likely that you will join too. Environmental, the presence of the armed group, knowledge of the local area. This is something that's happening in Valpes. I talked about that earlier. Valpes is, as I'm sure you know, is a really vast jungle of a department. There are no roads. You can only travel by plane or by really long boat rides. And what happens is, because the dissidents that now operate in Valpes are kind of dissidents are arriving from other areas, they're not from that zone, they basically arrive not knowing the area, and they need to understand the kind of difficult, vast geography of Valpes to move their drugs through to Brazil and Venezuela. And so they need the knowledge of local people, and they are kidnapping and forcing indigenous teenagers to join them because they know the region. And then we have the criminal factors, which we're all familiar with: kidnap, deceit, blackmail, threats, sexual reasons, and insurgency. I've listed insurgency there. I'm not sure, even though insurgency is criminal, not sure we should think of it as criminal. But it's very unusual anyway for children to join for ideological reasons. It's very unusual to hear a 13-year-old talking about, they joined the FARC because of their love of Marx. That doesn't happen. It's something that they learn once they're in the armed group. But ideology plays a very tiny part in this concept of forced recruitment. And we talk about children at risk. So there's a whole bunch of literature on how can we identify, how can we help children, how can we protect children and teenagers from being recruited. And so there's a whole bunch of sociology and psychology literature trying to help us identify some of the factors that might place children at risk. So teachers, psychologists, support workers, social workers can identify these factors and protect children, either by moving them out or by working with them to raise awareness of forced recruitment. So these are all issues that we're really familiar with, I'm sure. Negative life events, your parents being killed makes you more vulnerable, more susceptible, for example. If your family abandon you to go and work on the farm every day, and you're alone, and you're an 8-year-old, and you live in the middle of nowhere in Caquetá, it makes you vulnerable. Maybe you have friends who are already part of the group. Maybe you have family members. So all of these things are factors that we are really familiar with. But there are new factors which are not necessarily being taken into account. And these are new factors that have emerged since the peace process. So since the peace process, recruitment in a way has changed, because now we see children being recruited almost on a part-time basis. So children are not necessarily taken off to live in the camps with the insurgents like they were, in the 1990s. Now children often still go to school, still live at home. And we see that armed groups are targeting students that are intelligent, students that are popular, and students that basically perform well at school, because they want bright children. They don't want children to just join them as cannon fodder, people that will just pick up a gun, fight, and if they're killed, then it's just one other dead soldier. It's no big loss to the group, unfortunately. But we've seen a shift away from that. They want young, bright children that can encourage other children to join them because they're popular. And so they're filling their ranks this way. And they want bright children because in some ways, I think they need to, post-peace agreement armed groups are kind of trying to do everything quickly. They're trying to redefine drugs networks. They're trying to redefine all of their trafficking networks. And so they don't have time to employ children that might be risky, or children that need training, or children that need looking after. And so they're going for the bright kids because they are the children that they can rely on, and they're the children that can work of their own initiative. And so this is just a way, if we're thinking about how we combat forced recruitment in the community, then we kind of need to turn it on its head and think about how bright children are now being recruited as much as those that are considered or that were considered the risky cases before. So just a quick look at how forced recruitment is happening post-peace agreement. 73% increase between 2017 and 2018. These are the latest. There are no numbers available for 2019 yet. They come out in July. So a 73% increase. And the UN says that these numbers are just the tip of the iceberg, because these are the only cases that they've been able to verify.
Sorry, Matthew, can you please tell us a little bit about the origin of these numbers?
Yeah. These numbers are UN numbers. So the total, let me just find the... So there were 169 cases in 2017 and 293 cases in 2018. That's a 73% increase, and it's what the UN say is the tip of the iceberg, that there are many more cases than this. These are the only cases that A, are reported, and B, that they can verify. The UN doesn't include cases unless it's been able to investigate that, yes, this was a case of forced recruitment. And what's happening now in 2019, speaking to the UN, is, again, they expect an increase, but the problem is they no longer have the resources to investigate the reports that are landing on their desk. And so that's why they say the true number in reality is much, much bigger. And they don't have the ability to investigate anymore. And also, again, from my experiences in Valpes, from my experiences in Chocó, there are communities that are not, they simply don't report this. So I met a father of a 17-year-old in Valpes. He'd arrived in Mitu. And as I said, and as you know, Valpes is a huge department. And he came from a community called Wacuraba, which is a 6-day boat ride from Wacuraba to Mitu, to where he had to report the case of forced recruitment. First of all, he had no money, so it took him 7 months to save the money to buy the boat ticket to arrive to Mitu. Once he arrived in Mitu, the forced recruitment case had happened 7 months previously. He arrived at the Defensoría del Pueblo to make the report, to make the denuncia, but he changed his mind. He didn't want to report it because he suddenly got scared that it might make life more dangerous for his son, that it might make life more dangerous for him. So again, the Defensoría have a whole bunch of figures which are much higher than the UN figures, which they can't officially do anything with because they're not official denuncias. They're just people that arrive and say, look, this happened, they took my child, you should know about this, but I am not signing anything, I am not going to hacer una denuncia. So this is why these figures they're shocking, because you can see the rise, but they're only part of the picture. And in 2017, you can see that the ELN was responsible for most of the cases that existed. And then in 2018, we see that it's the dissident FARC. And in 2019, the figures that are not yet released, but they also show that it's the ex-FARC that is massively recruiting children and teenagers. So what do kids do when they're in the armed group? These are some of the roles you can see there. So this is kind of my definition for how kids move through the ranks of armed groups. So they start out with what we might call foundation membership, kind of, they're not really in the armed group yet, but they're working for the armed group, and they're probably still living at home. So messengers, people that move notes around or carry out errands for the armed groups. Mules, those that move drugs around from one place to another. Sex workers and farm workers, people that cultivate the coca, that harvest the coca, and then they move gradually to the core membership. you don't just start life as a sicario. It's very unusual for that to happen, because first the armed group needs to gain your trust. And so they gain your trust by giving you something easier to do first. And so that's why you might start as working as a farmer and then become a campanero, which is a lookout, I'm sure you know, or a guia. A guia is someone that moves drugs around, but on a much bigger scale. So a mule is someone that moves drugs within a municipality, for example, but a guia is someone that moves the drugs from department to department. And then we have the bigger roles like the sicario, the piloto, which is the person that drives the motorbike for the sicario, the soldiers, so these are the guys and the girls that are inside the armed groups, or the armorers, they're people that look after the weapons. And then we have this kind of idea of criminal graduates. So once you've been through all of these roles, that's when you become, senior commanders, if you like, and the kind of kingpins that you hear about that control organized criminal groups. So I've rushed through that because I want to show you the film. Do make a note of my details. If you have any questions, need any help with anything, then feel free to get in touch anytime, and I would be happy to help you. Before we show the film, is there any questions?
I'm sure that there are a number of questions, so I encourage you to raise your hands, and we can have an orderly discussion. So there were a couple of questions in the chat room. So maybe those of you who wrote things there can raise your hands and pose a question.
Yeah, I don't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen, which is...
That's okay. So I can start asking you a question, Matt. Okay, we have a question from Darío. Darío, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so what would you consider is the reason behind the increase and the tip of the iceberg in the forced recruitment after the peace agreement? And I would like to know about your reason or your hypothesis behind this.
Maybe before we answer Darius' question, we can take a couple of questions. Yep. So I'm going to mute you, Dario, and I'm going to unmute Daniela. Go ahead, Daniela, we are listening to you.
My question is, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
My question is, how those groups convince bright kids in order to join the groups? Maybe we can assume that if those bright kids have good grades, they are able to get a better future. How they are convinced to join a group like that?
Right. So your question is particularly focused on these kids that are performing well in school, right? Like how do the group convince those kids that are doing well, that are smart, that are skillful? Okay, thank you, Daniela.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to mute you, Daniela, and I'm going to unmute Valentina. Valentina, we hear you.
Okay, so my question is, so you're telling us many of these children do not consider themselves as forcefully recruited, but they are automatically considered this way by the law and by the state. So first of all, is it possible to say that the legal and the state perception of this phenomenon is actually biased? And how has this affected the way that the Colombian state has like built its policies for in order to combat this form of recruitment in a way that actually like gives is able to help these children, like to reintegrate in society.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Valentina. So we are going to do the following. We are going to give Matthew the option of responding to some of these questions, and we will do another round of questions afterwards.
Okay, really good questions. The first one, in terms of why are we seeing a rise in forced recruitment post peace agreement? Well, I think there's a simple reason for that, and that is that basically we've seen an expansion of armed groups generally trying to move in and fill the void replaced by the FARC. So you have the Autodefensas Gaitanistas, the Clan del Golfo, whatever you want to call them, expanding and moving in to take over the share of the illicit trade that was left behind by FARC. And also you have the dissident FARC factions moving in to do the same, trying to hold on to the economies that they controlled before, but without the manpower that they had, because obviously their numbers are depleted, because the vast majority of FARC guerrillas have demobilized and are sticking to the demobilization and reintegration processes. And so they need people basically in their ranks, and it's easier for them to recruit children and teenagers than anybody else. And then I think we have to look at specific cases. We have to look at it more closely than that. And that's why I mentioned Valpez, because if you, and this is a really good example to think of, to analyze this specific question, because in Valpez was never really a department that was massively affected by the conflict. There was a presence of the guerrilla, and Me Too was obviously taken by the guerrilla in 1997. But Valpez has now become what we call a transit state, which means it's a department through which drugs move, and that never happened before. It was used by the guerrilla as a base because it's so remote and it's difficult for the army to get there. But now Valpez is being used as a trafficking route. So the drugs and cocaine that are being produced elsewhere in Colombia, in Caquetá and other places are shipped through Valpez to Brazil, because there's a new criminal alliance between the dissident FARC and what we call the Family of the North, which is a big criminal mafia organization in northern Brazil. They have a drug trafficking alliance. And so now the FARC are moving drugs through Valpez to get to Brazil. But the problem is the people that are in the insurgents or the criminals within the dissident FARC are not from Valpez, and they don't know Valpez. And Valpez is really difficult in terms of geography to navigate and find your way through the jungle to get to Brazil. And so one of the reasons that there's been a huge rise of recruitment in the past 2 years in Valpez is the armed group, the dissident FARC, are taking children to guide them through the jungle to make sure that their merchandise, their drugs, get from Valpez to Brazil. And so, yeah, I think that's a really good example of why children are being recruited, why there's been an increase in recruitment by dissident FARC. A, they want to boost their numbers, to maintain control of the illicit economies that they controlled before, and B, they are using children for specific skills that they don't have, like navigation through the jungle in Valpez. And then how do they convince, the second question, how do they convince bright kids? A really good and important question. And I think in some ways it's difficult to answer. I know one of these kids quite well. I've come to know a kid from Cauca who's really bright. He was involved in the animation project that I told you about, and hopefully we'll have time to see. He's 14. He's very bright. He has excellent grades. But and these are his words, he's poor. And so it doesn't matter if he does well at school, because he lives, in an indigenous community on the margins of Colombia. He doesn't see how it's possible for him to leave that community, to go to university and he wants to be an artist, to study art and progress. He just doesn't see that opportunity is available for him. And so he says that really the only way of earning money is to work with the armed groups. And he's playing a really, really dangerous game, because what he's doing is working for both the paramilitary or neo-paramilitary organization that exists in Cauca and the dissident FARC. And sometimes he plays them off each other. And that's a really, dangerous and difficult situation to be in. The saddest thing, I think, is that his teachers know about this, and there's very little that they can do, and there's very little that they have done. I also know his mum has taken away his mobile phone, for example, so it's difficult for him to contact people and for him to be contacted, but I'm sure he still finds a way. So again, in brief, to answer that question, it's a really important question, and it's one that organizations on the ground working with marginalized communities need to investigate and need to think carefully about. But I would suggest that, what we might think is doing well at school and getting good grades, which opens up all kinds of possibilities for studying in these really marginalized and specifically indigenous marginalized communities, there is, even if you get good grades, there is still few opportunities for you to leave your community and progress. And then the question about the law and whether there's a legal bias. Again, this is really, really, really complex. The law has to be there to protect children, right? We all understand that. And so in some ways, the law is there to protect these kids. If we suddenly said, well, let's not make forced recruitment illegal, let's make it legal, then we'd have even more problems on our hands. So I don't think the law needs to be changed. In fact, I think, the law is rigid, and it's rigid for a reason. But what we need to do is understand why these kids think that they're volunteering, and understand that maybe we shouldn't think about it as being forced or volunteering, because, as I said before, there's this area in between those two possibilities, which is the area really where most forced recruitment takes place. And if we look at that, and you mentioned the state, is the state kind of not responding properly? Well, the state is protecting these kids because it's saying if it's under 18, under 15, it's illegal. But what the state needs to do is then say, well, why do these kids want to? Yeah, why do they want to? And then we see the underlying issues. Then we see, well, they want to because they're poor or because they have no families. And then all of those reasons point to state failure. So instead of the state thinking about the law, because the law is already in place, I would argue that the state needs to think about the underlying reasons that force children to think that they want to join a criminal group. And even though children say they want to join, once they join, and this is obvious when you talk to children or adults that have demobilized, it was never what they expected. It was very rarely what they expected. They joined and it was more dangerous. It was harder than what they wanted. And that's because children don't necessarily make the best decisions for themselves because they're too young. And that's a really complex argument to get into. And I don't think we should ignore what children say. I argued the opposite in the presentation. I think we depoliticize children when in fact they have a voice, and we should listen more to those voices. But we need to understand where those voices are coming from. And if we look at the underlying issues, it points to state failure.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. That is very sad at way too many levels, right? And very worrying. So I would like to ask you a couple of questions from the chat, people that are raising questions that are aligned to what you just said. So one is, and I think it's a really good question as well, is what security strategy do you think is best in order to reduce the children recruitment? So what could like the armed forces or the security apparatus of the state do to reduce this phenomenon? And then the other one is if the army has responded to these new ways or new techniques of the armed groups. Is the army responding in a positive way? Are they like on top of these changes? And then I would like to give to unmute Rosa. Rosa, would you like to ask your questions? You have been raising your hand for a while.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, I'm making a research about the guarantees and reparation mechanisms that the government is offering to the minors that were forced recruited by FARC. And like we find that there are not, that some points are not clear. And one of them is like the guarantees for those childs that are almost 16, under 16 and 18 years old. And I really want to ask if like that blank space in those guarantees is making them like join other types of armed groups because they feel that they were not be repaired, or they don't have like other ways to live because that's the only things they know how to do.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. So can I just clarify? Are you asking if children that have demobilized are rejoining again because of the lack of reparations?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Rosa. Sebastián Robles. Sebastián?
Hello.
Yes, we hear you.
Yes. So I have a question. You say that the groups want the children to have some initiative, and I don't know why, because, well, that could be dangerous for the group because they want obedient people, right? And why did they want them to have initiative? Yes?
Right. Okay, yeah, I understand the question as well. Really good question.
Right,
I would
you.
like to make one question. It's like, what does it mean as a society, as a country, that we have gone through so many disarmament and demobilization and reintegration processes, and still it looks so easy for the groups to find thousands, not hundreds, thousands of recruits throughout the country. So we had the demobilization of the paramilitary groups in the 2000s, about, I don't know, 7,000 former paramilitary members demobilized, and yet all those criminal organizations that emerged afterwards found thousands of new recruits. And we are experiencing that same processes all over again, right? Like we had the demobilization of the FARC, and yet we are having this dissident groups and ELN and other guerrillas and other criminal organizations that are recruiting again. So what does that mean as a society, that we have gone through this so many times, and yet it still seems so easy for the armed groups and the criminal organizations to continue recruiting?
Yeah. It's really depressing. Okay, so
very depressing.
Yeah. The first question was about the security response. Well, if you speak to the army, and I have many times, they will say that they are dealing with this issue. And in one way, they absolutely deny that this issue is as big as it really is. And that's because the army failed to look beyond official statistics. So they say, well, there were only 60 cases, and that's nothing. And it's, the answer to that is, well, there are 60 cases that were reported and people don't report it because they're scared and for all the reasons that we talked about earlier. And so the army doesn't necessarily see this as an issue. However, saying that, in Valpes, there was a particular group of 5 dissident guerrillas, 3 men, 2 women, that were basically in charge of recruitment in 2017. And these people were identified to the army through intelligence and through local community leaders. And the army did track these 5 people down and killed them. But the recruitment continues because they killed those 5 and there's another 5 behind them still doing their work. So in a way, I would argue that we need to think beyond the security response, because the security response, although important, is only one part of it. We need to think about how we improve lives for people living in these communities. In terms of socio-economic circumstances, but also in terms of their security. So maybe we have to have, and I don't like the thought of this, but maybe we have to have more army presence or more police presence in these indigenous communities because they are extremely vulnerable. So yeah, it's a difficult question, but I think we need to think beyond security to think about the kind of social responses. And that also kind of answers, I think, the second question as well, which, how is the army responding to these new techniques? The army is not open to listening to how this situation. The army looks at the official statistics. It sees that those statistics may be rising, but in the bigger scheme of things, they're still quite small. And so it's not a priority for the army in some places. But I think the army response is difficult because, again, in Valpes, one of their they have launched a campaign against forced recruitment to raise awareness of forced recruitment. And so this is another way that the army can get involved beyond weapons and killing people, is by working with the community. But the way it does that is just another form of indoctrination. So its way of raising awareness with communities about forced recruitment is saying, the guerrillas are the bad guys, we're the good guys, and if you want to play with guns, come and play with our guns because they're safer than the FARC's guns. And that's not a way to solve this crisis, this problem at all. But it's a difficult situation for the army. If we want to be understanding to the army, then they have to do both. They have to protect us in terms of security. They have to do community work. But the way they do their community work is through indoctrination. And I think that's just as dangerous and is just the same as what the armed groups have done and do in local communities. And then this idea of reparations, and whether or not the lack of reparation forces kids to join again. I'm not sure I'm aware of any particular case where a child has demobilized, has not had reparations, and has decided to join again. So I'm not sure I could comment on that specific issue.
But I do have I do have a story to tell about that. It's not a kid that joined again, but so the situation is the following. So when the FARC demobilized, and there were a few children in each of the fronts, right? And so since they were minors, then the ICBF took them, right? They took them even though they had been part of the group for a good number of years. So they put them in shelters or in places in which nobody took care of them, and they felt lonely, they felt that they had a family before, and now nobody took care of them. So I went to the ETCR of Agua Bonita in Caquetá, where there are like 200 former FARC members, and there were like 5 or 6 minors that, after having been in the ICBF shelters for a while, and that they were hungry, they were not having proper education, they themselves took the decision of going back to the FARC, to the community that they were forming, in which, you know, things are doing actually very well in that particular place. Like, they are having a lot of employment options, they have a lot of productive projects, etc. So the children, they felt that being in the hands of the state was much worse than going back to the links and networks and the community that the FARC had formed. So in that case, we don't have another. They didn't join another group. They didn't they didn't start. They didn't become criminals again, but they went back to the networks and the links of the FARC group.
Yeah, and I think that relates to the question we had earlier about, you know, the law and the state response, and you know, this is probably a case of the law being applied, and in a ridiculous circumstances, the law is there, but the law is there to be interpreted, and the fact that the state removed kids from their own families, you know, and placed them into care is just ridiculous. I mean, how can anyone think that that is a sensible option? In terms of the kids that demobilized in 2016, you know, as part of the demobilization of the FARC, again, that's also curious, because officially, I think there were only a couple of hundred, not even maybe, of kids that were demobilized. And in some ways, I think the FARC sensed that this was going to happen, because children were kind of gradually demobilized. Before the official demobilization, children were gradually sent away from the camps, sent back to families, and sent to what they considered to be safe places. So they weren't part of that demobilization for 2 reasons, I think. One is the FARC didn't want to admit that it had been recruiting children. But secondly, I think to protect the children that it had recruited, it sent them back, because most of them were related to insurgents anyway. Sent them back to those families because I think it knew that ICBF and the state would react in that way. And it's talking about the ICBF, it reminded me of something that happened in Valpes with last January, an 18-year-old. So he was recruited as a 17-year-old, but a year later went back to visit his family in a village. But the army were there. Someone had tipped them off, and the army wanted to arrest this kid because he joined the dissident FARC. He tried to run. They shot him in the leg, and he surrendered. This is according to witnesses. Obviously, I wasn't there. But then they executed him. They shot him in the head. And this was witnessed by a 13-year-old who was then threatened by the army. And this 13-year-old has been taken into care by ICBF to protect him. So you have the state taking a child into care to protect the child from the state, from the army, which is, again, it's just a ludicrous situation to be in. I think re-recruitment, as in, children join an armed group, they leave, they rejoin, happens. I know many ex-combatants that were part of, both paramilitary and FARC guerrilla groups. And in fact, I met one guy who, his brother was killed by the FARC when he was 12. And he says at that moment, he then devised this revenge strategy. So when he became 16, or maybe later, he joined the army. He did national service. So he did a year with the army. After the army, he then joined the FARC, the people that had killed his brother. But he left the FARC after a year and joined the paramilitaries with all the knowledge, so with the military training and with the knowledge that he'd learned of the local FARC front in his area, to use that within the paramilitaries to seek revenge for the murder of his brother. And that's quite calculating, but it just shows how the emotional impact of conflict can really, impact on why young people especially decide to join armed groups. And then what was the next question? Well, why do they use kids with initiative? Two reasons, I think. And you're so right to say that that's a dangerous strategy for the armed group, because they don't want people with brains, because they become a risk to the power structure. But in the short term, I would argue that they do, because they're having to keep up with an illicit drugs trade that is moving beyond their current capabilities. And so they don't want children that they have to train. They want children that can fall quickly into that. Is that going to become a problem for the armed group later? Possibly. But I also think it's not just about their role in the drugs trade. I think they want bright kids or popular kids, because they want those kids to be able to manipulate other kids into joining, to make their numbers bigger. So I think that's it saves them a job of going into schools and recruiting. If they can have one bright popular kid that's doing it for them, it saves them a job. And then as a country, and why after so many, or after two major demobilization processes, we see this issue coming back time and time again. And I think this relates to answers I've already given and questions that were already asked in a way about the state response. Demobilization and the security aspect is really just one side of it. And until measures are taken to improve lives in marginalized communities, in terms of state presence, just in terms of having a police station or having the army, but definitely in terms of improving education, improving health, and improving the economy, this issue will continue. Because for as long as there are armed groups, for as long as armed groups are allowed to dominate regions, then forced recruitment will continue. And forced recruitment will continue for as long as children and teenagers feel this lack of opportunity.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Valentina, I think that we run out of time, and I know that you had an animation to show us, and I am wondering if maybe it's possible to send the students a link so they can watch them on their own, and maybe we can participate in a forum regarding that animation that I'm sure it's a very great contribution in a different format on this topic that also helps us like raise awareness on the multiple sources of reasons and motives and risk factors that are driving the problem of children recruitment. Thank you very much, Matthew. This was really extraordinary. Thanks a lot.
I hope I didn't speak too quickly.
No, I think you didn't. So we are going to finish the session now. Thank to all the students who showed up. We had the full classroom was here. All of my students showed up today. So thanks a lot for coming, and we will give you. I am going to give you more instructions on over WhatsApp. So they are saying thank you in the chat room. I don't know if you are reading that, Matthew. Are you?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Take care.
Okay. See you. Bye bye.